Why do you think it was that these critics who were such brilliant and courageous people, were not able to get along with each other? You know, they have their different theories and they practically go to war with each other. I mean, Sylvia Maher, you know, a very good researcher in many ways, was down on David Lifton for working with one of the lawyers for I forget his name, Liebler, yeah, Wesley Liebler. Oh, she really trashed him for that. And yet here's a mind that is so well developed, a mind that seems to be so open that they'd realize they have disagreements, but they can be resolved, or when there's a disagreement, things need to be followed up. What drove these people at each other's throats?
Well, obviously I can't speak for any one of them, and as John said, they were all individuals with their own points of view and from many, from diverse backgrounds, and somebody used the term conspiracy theory. I think it was you just said conspiracy theorist, and they really that's a term that bothers me because I don't think any of these people really. I don't think people really. They weren't not really conspiracy theorists. I mean, it seems to me naive to look back at it now, but what they really wanted to do, especially in the first couple of years after the assassination, was to get the case reopened by the government. They wanted to demonstrate the flaws in the official report and alert the public to those flaws, and then get the case reopened, which kind of seems silly because if the government, as some of us believe, was responsible for the crime, what's the point in having them reinvestigate it? They'll just come to the same conclusion. But anyway, as for why all these disagreements, I mean, you just have a diverse group of people with different backgrounds and points of view, and it seems to me it would be a minor miracle if they had gotten along any better.
They were also, to some extent, over the years, infiltrated and trashed against each other, and I'm sure that they, tried to start fights between them, or discrepancies, as they did with many other movements. But I think I wasn't as old as they were, but I think the mood at the time generally is not what it is today. Today, in the wake of the Kennedy assassination, which was really the beginning of this trend, there's almost universal skepticism and distrust of the government. But in those days, it was almost exactly the opposite, so that they would have looked at the commission as if it was a mistake or a flaw, but they wouldn't have expected that there wasn't something that might counter it or correct it somewhere else in the government system, that you could count on some objectivity from someplace, even if this particular group of people had messed up or done something, self-serving, that could easily be exposed.
And even before Jim Garrison, there was a New York a Republican congressman named Theodore Kupferman who, in I think September or October of '66, actually proposed, introduced some resolution to not to reinvestigate the crime, but to see whether to review the commission's work and to see whether a reopening of the case would have been justified, and that unfortunately was never. It just died.
He endorsed
whatever Congress that was. It ended their session without doing anything about the resolution. He reintroduced it, and the same thing happened, which was nothing.
He endorsed Sylvia Maher's book, Accessories After the Fact, I think.
Yes, he did. He was associated with the issue for a year or two, and he was part of an early effort to get at the autopsy pictures and X-rays, and he was no more successful than anybody else was in that period. So anyway,
but I think your point is taken that they were not. I mean, we've all been lumped now with this conspiracy theory thing, but they weren't even that far along. They were critics.
Right.
They were people that were doing an objective analysis. They weren't immediately coming up with a theory to explain it all or assuming that they had a conclusion from it. They just said that this conclusion was wrong. And I wish in a way that there were more of that objectivity left. I mean, this sort of universal skepticism and ability to imagine anything, even that you somehow live in some kind of a matrix where everything you're told is a lie, and everything is invented, and I think it's left us with almost anything. I mean, I said now I believe there are conspiracy theorists because all it takes is too much time on your hand and a website. you know, and, but I think, you know, we were investigators, researchers, and critics, and, you know, even into the second and third generation, I think, before we got to this point that you just made up anything, and, you know, well, the government, I remember going to one conference in Colorado, and they had 2 American flags at the top, and it said, do you know the government lied to you about the Kennedy assassination? The second line was, do you know the government lied to you about the Holocaust? So our critique became the standard for the idea that the government lies, but then anything can be said to be a lie. And, you know, I remember that, I don't know if you ever saw Assassination Please Almanac.
Yeah.
And there's a great cartoon drawing in there, sort of, it's cartoonish, but it's a phone conversation going on, and it has Sylvia Maher, and it has Penn Jones, and it has Mae Brussel, and Mark Lane, I think, is in it, and it's just this circle of people, and they're all on the phone to each other, excited, talking to each other. But if you get the book out, I'm sure you'll see it. But it was always a kind of an itch. I think Sherman Skolnick was in it.
Was that republished a couple of years ago?
I think it was republished. I think he did bring it back up. I got my best backhand compliment in that book. It said, John Judge, voluminous research, conclusions few others reach.
I think what the reverse amplify what you were saying.
Mike, can you get this one?
The only theory, well, with the exception of, I know it was one of the books that suggested that Ruby killed Kennedy, was one of the shooters, and, you know, he actually had to get rid of Oswald. But other than that, and that was just kind of a suggestion, the only theory was the Warren Commission's theory. None of the major, you know, the early critics, none of them, as far as I know, I read all of them at the time, and they didn't have any theories. They wanted to know who did it, and they wanted it investigated.
Somebody on the Knoll a few years ago was approached by a press person and said, what's the craziest theory you ever heard about the Kennedy assassination? He said, the Warren Commission. The press guy said, no, seriously.
One of the things I took away from your book, I think the main thing was that this idea of cooperation, the idea of, I mean, we can't accept fascists, right? But beyond that, we have to be able to sort of get along with each other to some extent. Because I grew up around professors, you know, my dad's a professor, and I grew up in academia, and the whole idea in becoming a professor is to get into some field, get something that belongs to you, and then carve it out and don't let anybody in, right? That's the way a lot of this works. You write, you do your thesis on some idea, and I see that a lot in some of these, you know, like in the Kennedy assassination, you grab your theory, and that's your theory, and that's going to stay that way for 40 years, no matter what happens.
Right.
And we can't do that. We have to be able to just go with the facts and talk to each other, I guess. That's one of the things I came away with from the book.
Did you have a hand a couple minutes ago?
I was just wondering what if Mark Lane is still around and what he's doing now.
Last I knew, he was, I think, is working on an autobiography, and somebody's making supposedly a documentary about him. I had Shirley Martin's son, was a guy named Stephen Martin, and he, a couple years ago, gave me a picture. He gave me Shirley Martin's son, Stephen, gave me a picture of Lane and with Bertrand Russell and 2 or 3 other unidentified people. And I didn't use it in my book, but I think I had it on a website, and so Lane's office, some woman from Lane's office contacted me, I think last spring, and said, oh, how can we get a copy of this picture? So I sent him one. And I was briefly in contact with him, and that's what she said. He was working on I think on an autobiography, and somebody is working on some kind of documentary about him. I don't know if it's his whole life or what, but so that's, as far as I know, he's still around. He was, I think he's around 80. He's about this. Because he was here 10 years ago too, at the COPA, 98 COPA
Yeah, he
conference.
spoke on the Knoll.
Yeah, he was great. He was great. And so, yeah, he's...
Last I heard of him, he was doing some work on Hinckley's behalf, trying to get him out of the mental institution. Get him...
Well, he spoke over the internet 5 years ago, too.
Did he? Yeah.
Lane did?
I'm sure people still interview him. I mean, the last works he did, you know, he did the book on Martin Luther King with Dick Gregory, codenamed Zorro, and that was later called The Assassination of MLK. And then he did Strongest Poison about Jonestown, and I think after that was Plausible Evidence.
Yeah, Plausible Denial. Yeah.
So he kept up the work. I haven't seen anything real recent, but
Yeah, he was kind of difficult for me, too. There was a lot about him on the public record, and a lot of them in the stuff that I got from Salandria that filled in most of the gaps, and it was really hard for me even to contact him, and I finally did get an interview with him, and we talked for about an hour or so. It was, obviously it was over the telephone, so I couldn't see him, so it wasn't really body language, but after a while I got that sense like, I'm done talking to you, I want to stop this conversation. He didn't come right out and say it, but I said, well, can we follow this up tomorrow? And he said, sure, call me back. And we set up a time, and I called him, and nobody answered. So tried a few more times, and I never got a hold of him again until this thing with the picture cropped up, but nothing really came of that. So anyway, but so far as I know, he's still around.
well, thanks, John.
Yeah,
That's
thank you.
Great. Sorry we didn't have a podium and a mic stand for you. Mal Hyman's here with us at the moment, and see Gerald McKnight. I asked him to come over. He was on the knoll, but I hope he will. But Mal is a teacher in North Carolina and an educator, and he's done some classes on the assassination work, and he's specifically been putting in some focus on the media and the Kennedy assassination. So.
Give me a couple minutes to get my manuscript. I didn't know I was going to.
Okay, no, that's fine. I'll put you up next. Yeah.
You know, speaking of early research, one of the things Joachim Yosten pointed out was that many of the papers had a time of... Some of the papers, I forget the exact detail, but some of the newspapers had Kennedy shot before 12:30. And he went and he checked, he checked it kind of carefully. He spoke in a very thick German accent and said that he wanted to see how the efficiency of American journalism, something like that. And has anybody ever followed up on that, or do you know anything about that? I mean, how were they getting the story written before it happened?
Well, Fletcher Prouty had some timing that showed that Oswald and his whole background was out before he was arrested.
And didn't Seth Cantor sort of say the same thing?
Yeah. And that was reminiscent to me on 9/11, because if you remember, almost immediately they had the 15 hijackers, and they had their backgrounds, and they had their photos, and linked together, and identities. And in Mueller's book, if you go read at least the hardbound edition, I don't know if it's in the softback, he was the head of the FBI. He was complaining that they had poor equipment, and they couldn't fax properly, and they didn't have good computers, and it took a long delay to get the names and the photos together to put them up. I've got a mic on, all right. And so, and they said that they got them from the manifest, on the plane manifest of who was on the plane. Well, when the manifest was released, none of the names of the hijackers are on there. I mean, there's holes. There's like, if the count is 100 and there's 4 hijackers, there's 96 names, and then there's 4 holes. But you would think, since the airline can be sued if they don't release a full manifest in a crash, that if the names matched, they would have put them on there. In other words, somebody had to call and say, don't put them on there because they don't match the official list. But in addition to that, he said that they didn't get the names together until 10 that morning, and with their photos. 10 that morning? I mean, the plane is just going down like 6 minutes later. The last plane's hitting the deck. I mean, how on earth could they have had them by 10 in the morning unless they had them as a preset story, of who they were going to blame? And because you couldn't even reconstruct the airline manifest that soon. It would take you a few hours to call, and because just who's got a reservation doesn't tell you who got on the plane, and that's by the ticket. And the airline itself wouldn't have been able to put it together by 10 that morning. But I mean, you're barely just identifying which planes it is, much less who's on them. But yet they had this immediate list of the suspects that could go out. So.
Well, in '63, though, it's even more ridiculous because there's no internet research or anything else. So
Yes.
all the information that's coming out. I don't know, maybe it's possible, but it kind of surprised me that the next day's Dallas paper had an article about the members of the actual Fair Play for Cuba Committee.
Yeah.
And it just surprised me.
I think the cover story was well established, and it's like when Ruby, if you remember, was at one of the press conferences with Oswald. and Captain Fritz said he's a member of the Free Cuba Committee. And Ruby says, no, it's fair play for Cuba Committee. Well, this strip joint owner and mob guy in Dallas knows the difference? I mean, who told him that? I mean, and he doesn't know Oswald? So somebody had to tell him about the fair play for Cuba Committee. I mean, he did know about Cuban politics. He ran guns for the CIA to Castro with McWillie, and so he might have had some knowledgeability, but I mean, just to off the top of his hat, say, no, fair play for Cuba Committee. Well, it's a little bit of a stretch,
Since Oswald was the only member.
Yeah, that's right. At least there were other members of the real organization, but he was the only one that applied.
On that same topic, the APB that went out over the description of Oswald, so-called, the
Yeah.
Warren Commission tried to say was from Brennan.
Yeah, who wasn't looking up.
Peter Scott points out in this essay I was mentioning that it's interesting that the height and weight on there, 165 pounds, is about 20 or so pounds overweight for Oswald. But
Yeah.
it does happen to be the exact number in his FBI file.
Yeah, right. So they got the official, or which Oswald are they describing is the next question. But yeah, and I mean, I think there's indications that in several places that the Dallas, some segment of Fritz's team already had a photo of Oswald ahead of time of who they were going to pick up. And one indication of that is, to me, the inexplicable story of the motorcycle cop, is it Marion Baker, I think, that stops and gets off and saw pigeons fly off of the fifth floor window ledge and thought it came from up there and ran in, and he asked Truly, the building manager, how to get up to the fifth floor, and they're on they're in hot pursuit going up these stairs, and he gets to the second floor, and there's a little diamond-shaped window into the employee cafeteria where they buy their Coke and sit and eat their lunch, and he sees Oswald sitting in there, and he not only knocks the door open, he pulls his gun. Well, what on earth is the guy sitting there got to do with the guy he's pursuing on the fifth floor if he doesn't already know who he's looking for? And then Truly intervenes and says, no, he's okay, he works here, because that's not where they're supposed to arrest him, not with plan. Then later, it's the shoe store owner, Brennan, I think his name is.
Calvin Brewer.
Brewer? It's Brewer, yeah.
Calvin Brewer.
Calvin Brewer, and he's there, and his employee comes to him and says, hey, there's this suspicious-looking guy outside the window, and then he says he went into the theater and maybe didn't pay a ticket, and maybe we'll call the cops. And so this employee happens to be somebody that lives upstairs from Jack Ruby, and he gets this guy involved, but he goes down there, and tells his story to the commission. He calls the cops. 26 police descend on this guy that didn't buy a theater ticket, and the cop grabs the phone and calls Fritz from the little ticket booth, and he says, I think we've got our man on both counts. Before they have the man and the arrest or anything else, they're connecting Tippett and Kennedy, got him on both counts, and they go in the door, and this guy says that down at the bottom of the theater, the door opened, the cop came in, and there was somebody down there in the front row, and he stood up and said, the guy you're looking for is there, and points to Oswald. What was he doing? Crunching his popcorn too loud? I mean, talk about a setup. And then Oswald says, this is it. He realizes he's been positioned, and that they're going to frame him. And then, I think that gave him enough of an alert that when they came up there, I believe they came up there to kill him, he put his hand down into the breech of the gun that they brought in to kill him with. And I met these two old Dallas cops at one of the ASK conferences, and they came stumbling over, with that young guy that wrote first day evidence, told him I didn't believe, this and that. So, we hear you don't think Oswald owned a rifle or a pistol. I said, I didn't say that. I just said I don't think he owned the rifle and pistol that the commission said he had, because they were ordered through a P.O. box and they could never find a signature card on him, and there's no graphite on his hands that he fired a weapon, and all the discrepancies, that there's no oil from the gun on the blanket where he kept it, and no fibers from the blanket on the gun, and there's just nothing to really link it to Oswald, except after it goes to the FBI, then they find a fingerprint, but nobody finds it at this end. So I said I don't think those were his guns, and they said, what about that gun he brought in the theater with him? I said, I think you boys brought that in. They looked at each other, they grinned, they said, well, maybe we did. And I said, well, that'd be police procedure, wouldn't it? But I think it was a drop weapon, and they could kill Oswald with this gun that they were linking him to and then say he pulled it on them, But then instead of a dead red, they had a talking head, and they had trouble. So, There's so many discrepancies to the case, and I mean, these people that want to support the official version, you really, I mean, and if you read Bugliosi's book, it's just one twisted logic after another, you know, but.
You read it all?
No, I haven't read all of it, but I mean, you know, yeah, enough. The first page is enough. But, you know, I mean, he's the kind of guy that, okay, for years we argued that Oswald was only a marksman in the Marines, which is the lowest thing. He was not a good shot. There's no evidence that he practiced with guns afterwards, you know, except the one incident where he's supposed to go to a firing range and shot at some other guy's target 2 weeks before. And this is when he's also at Mexico City at the same time. And the guy complained. He said, "To the hell with you. Remember, I'm Lee Harvey Oswald. Remember my name." And lo and behold, when he's arrested, he does remember his name. But, you know, outside of things that set him up, you know, but I mean, he doesn't know about guns. You know, he keeps these guns around, but there's no evidence that, you know, I think Marina tried to say that he'd go out in the parks and practice with them. I'm not from Dallas. Can you go out in a public park and practice with a gun? I don't think so, even 63. I think somebody might come around and ask you, what the hell are you doing? You know, so it's, you know, it's a bit much, but I mean, he was not a good shot. And so a lot of us have said, you know, that along with the gun, his scope wasn't lined up with the bullets, you know, which the commission said that helped him. You know, but that he wasn't going to be able to make this shot, you know. Well, and so, you know, he's not a very likely candidate. Well, Bugliosi takes that and he says, "Oh, Oswald was such a terrible shot that no conspiracy would have hired him." Therefore, there was no conspiracy. But I mean, everything in the book is like that. But I mean, these people that believe the official version, I mean, I don't start on the defensive. I just say, well, show me the evidence to get Oswald up there to do it. Can you get him on the 6th floor? Can you bring him down the stairs? Can you put the gun in his hand? Can you show he owned it? Can you show he shot it? It's not there. I mean, you know, and that was a great slide he had, like where it said, like, you know, they were in a panic because the thing had fallen apart. Because when you looked at the evidence on all the counts, and that was Sylvia Maher's brilliance, you know, in Accessories After the Fact, she just demolished the whole thing. I mean, you know, what a sport! 3 bullets in a 6-bullet, you know, cartridge, and you know. You're going to go kill the president, you only take 3 bullets with you, you know, no return fire. Let's see if I can do it, you know. Lucky shot.
Not only that, he then goes back to the boarding house to get his pistol.
Yeah, that's right.
You know, as though he never thought he might need it in order to get away from the scene. I think he changed his clothes. I mean, he was rather blasé about getting away, you know what I mean?
Well, and as Walt pointed out, Walt Brown, the thing I read last night, you know, his route of escape was a bus going back to the scene of the crime. So, yeah.
Well, you know what Sylvia Maher said about that? Returning to the scene of a crime is classical, you know. But isn't time supposed to elapse?
Yeah, well, and also you have to be the criminal. But
now you're going to think I'm with the CIA.
yeah, might be. It, you know, but it's the same really when you go into all these with Sirhan and Arthur Bremer and even Hinckley. None of his bullets hit Reagan. When you do the actual work, Sirhan, you know, and Martin Luther King, Ray was not the person that fired the shot. And shot didn't come from the. So it's over and over and over again the same pack of lies in each of these cases, and the same obstinance and the same refusal to investigate, and just there's the official story, and the FBI backs it up and the press back it up, and that's that. So at this point, I mean, the press can't afford to pay any real attention to us because it's mud in their face that they went all these years without doing their work. So they say, yeah, there was a conspiracy. I remember it came over, the House Select Committee said there was a probable conspiracy to kill. And this is reading it, you know, and the House Select Committee today concluded there was a probable conspiracy to kill John Kennedy and Martin Luther King. And now for the weather. No, just another news item. You know, no significance to it. So, you know, but of course we don't have a media. We just have a corporate Wurlitzer, and we go on. But. It's not impossible to determine what happened in these things. I'm gonna, when Mal finishes, I'm gonna, Bill Turner wanted to come and couldn't, and he also had wanted to come to Pittsburgh and couldn't, and he prepared a paper for the Pittsburgh conference called RFK, Charles de Gaulle and the Farewell America Plot. So I thought told him I'd read you a little bit of his stuff, so.
He's alive.
Bill Turner's alive, yes. Mm-hmm. Lives in Los Angeles. He came to a recent COPA but he couldn't get to the other thing. And he came to our L.A. conference. He was there at that, spoke. Yeah, amazing guy. And I didn't know, but I mean, he was out of the FBI already, but he was hired early on. I think it was by Esquire, one of the major magazines, to come out here to Dealey Plaza. He was here right away and investigating it from the start.
Could I mention the availability of the previous conference? I didn't have enough copies to, but a few people got them already, of the June conference. And I also have the 3 and 4 DVD sets from several previous conferences. It's most of the DVDs have 6 to 8 hours on them, they're $3 per DVD. And I also have some 9/11 conferences there, and any of the money I raise will help me buy a new engine on my way home. Left my car at the house, so.
Ralph is our official videographer in most of the conferences, and came down in his car, and his car broke down on the way here, and he hitchhiked on a truck or something and got here.
Got
But
it right on a truck, a couple hours late. Talking out from Commerce, though,
that was nice of him.
that was nice.
Yeah, so, but he's been recording and putting out on very cheap DVDs. I think he charges you less than they cost him. Inexpensive, right? Just in case they tell you it's a cottage industry. Well, I could give you some background on Turner while we're waiting. He was an FBI agent. He specialized in counterespionage against the KGB from 1951 to 61. He was the agency's first whistleblower when he sought a congressional investigation into J. Edgar Hoover's softness on organized crime and career-building toughness on a moribund Communist Party USA. In 1963, he flew to Dallas to cover the JFK assassination. Oh, it's for Saga magazine. That's the one, reporting that Lee Harvey Oswald was a bureau informant handled by agents W. Harlan Brown and James Hosty. From 1965 to 69, Turner was senior editor of Ramparts on such diverse topics as Cesar Chavez and his United Farm Workers, FBI illegal spying, or tapping and bugging and burglaries, CIA infiltration of the National Students Association, and other dirty tricks for which he became a target. His articles on the paramilitary right brought him to the attention of the New Orleans DA, Jim Garrison, which in turn led him into the Farewell America plot. Turner was a delegate to the 1965 JFK conference sponsored by the Supreme Court of Rio de Janeiro, or 1995, I'm sorry, in which the judges concluded the assassination was a coup d'etat. Cyril Wecht and some of the other researchers were down at that. Among Turner's 8 books are Deadly Secrets, the CIA Mafia War Against Castro and the Assassination of John F. Kennedy, the Assassination of Robert F. Kennedy, The Conspiracy and Cover-Up, and his best-selling memoir, Rear View Mirror, looking back at the FBI, the CIA, and other tales, T-A-I-L-S. His the 10-second jailbreak was made into the movie Breakout, starring Charles Bronson and John Huston, and books have been translated into French, Spanish, Russian, Japanese, and Polish editions. So he's well known around the world. I'll start, and if he gets here, we can pick up some of it later. But
Noel is here. Noel is here.
oh, he's here. Are you back?
This is good if you're on a roll, so.
It's up to you. I mean, I'll do a little bit of this. As the 1968 election year loomed, America was bitterly divided, racked by race riots and violent anti-Vietnam War protests. Early in the year, President Lyndon Johnson, who had escalated the war after JFK was assassinated, resigned. The hopes of a new generation turned to Bobby Kennedy as the bearer of his brother's torch. I'll just intercept here. I just heard a radio thing, and I hadn't put the two together, but that resignation of LBJ was within days of the assassination of Martin Luther King. And I think that that's interesting, because when he's resigning, the momentum is to end the war, and it may have been a trigger.
I think, John, it was a few days before, March 31st, I think was the date
Yes.
of Johnson, that he wasn't going to run for re-election.
Yes.
And 4 days later is when Hawkins came.
Right, and I had not made that connection, but I heard it on a radio show, and I just think it's significant. That spring, a new book of mysterious origins hit the bestseller lists in Europe. Titled Farewell, America, it exposed the powerful forces that had been arrayed against JFK and brought about his death. As a promotional blurb put it, a revelation, the political, social, and economic forces which will always try to prevent men of the stamp of John and Robert Kennedy from leading or even from living.